Part 6, Chapter 5. The dawn of May 6th revealed an ugly scene. The wind was blowing nearly 50 knots from the northwest, and the Caird was straining into it, trying to hold to a northeasterly course. As every wave passed, some portion of it poured on board the boat. But it seemed really not to matter too much. They had been pounded and bruised and drenched almost to the point of insensibility. Furthermore, the wave during the night had somehow changed their attitude. For 13 days, they had suffered through almost ceaseless gales, then finally a huge rogue sea. They had been the underdog, fit only to endure the punishment inflicted on them. But sufficiently provoked, there is hardly a creature on God's earth that ultimately won't turn and attempt to fight, regardless of the odds. In an unspoken sense, that was much the way they felt now. They were possessed by an angry determination to see the journey through, no matter what. They felt that they had earned it. For 13 days, they had absorbed everything that the Drake Passage could throw at them, and now, by God, they deserved to make it. Their resolve was strengthened when Worsley worked out the position. It put them at 54 degrees 26 minutes south, 40 degrees 44 minutes west. If this figure was accurate, they were a scant 91 miles from the western tip of South Georgia, and very soon there should be a sign of land, a bit of seaweed or a piece of driftwood. As if to mock their determination, though, the sea rose menacingly throughout the morning. By noon it had grown so treacherous that Shackleton felt it was foolhardy to press on, though Worsley urged him to do so. At 1 o'clock, Shackleton gave the order to heave to. They came about and dropped the sail. The jib was run up the mainmast, and they began once again to tack back and forth into the wind. All of them fell sullen, even Shackleton, who from the beginning had required of the men that they make every effort to remain cheerful in order to avoid antagonisms. But it seemed too much to be so close, possibly only one good day's run, and to have to stop. The strain on Shackleton was so great that he lost his temper over a trivial incident. A small, bob-tailed bird appeared over the boat and flew annoyingly about, like a mosquito intent on landing. Shackleton stood it for several minutes, then he leapt to his feet, swearing and batting furiously at the bird with his arms. But he realized at once the poor example he had set and dropped back down again with a chagrined expression on his face. The rest of the afternoon passed without incident until almost dusk when Crean started to prepare the evening hush. A minute or two later, he called for Shackleton to come below. Crean handed him a mug of water to taste, and Shackleton took a small sip. Then a grave expression came over his face. The second cask of water, the one that had got adrift during the launching of the Caird from Elephant Island, was foul. It had the unmistakable brackish taste of seawater that apparently had seeped into it. Not only that, but the cask was hardly half full, indicating that a great deal of the water had leaked out. Crean asked Shackleton what he should do, and Shackleton, rather snappishly, replied that there was obviously nothing they could do. It was the only water they had, and they would have to use it. Crean went ahead and made the hush. When it was ready, the men sampled it cautiously and found that it was disagreeably salty. For Shackleton, the discovery meant simply that the need for haste had now become acute. As soon as it was dark and Worsley was at the helm, he went aft and the two men discussed the situation. Their food, Shackleton said, should last 2 weeks, but they had less than a week's supply of water, and that was brackish. Thus, a landing had to be made, and soon. The inevitable question then became, would they hit South Georgia? Shackleton asked Worsley how accurate he thought their navigation had been. Worsley shook his head. With luck, he said, maybe within 10 miles, but it was always possible to make a mistake. They both knew that except for one or two tiny islands, the Atlantic Ocean eastward beyond South Georgia is a void all the way to South Africa, nearly 3,000 miles away. If, through a miscalculation or because of a southerly gale, they missed the island, there would be no second chance. The land would then lie to windward of them, and they could never beat back toward it. They dared not miss. Fortunately, as the night wore on, the northwesterly gale diminished slightly, and the sky began to clear. At 1 a.m., Shackleton decided it was safe to get underway, and they again set their course for the northeast. The all-important thing now was to learn the position, but soon after dawn a fog-like mist moved in. They could see the sun, but only as a hazy outline. Worsley kept his sextant handy all morning, hoping that the fog would clear. After several hours, he took his notebook and, partly in desperation, he scribbled, "Most unfavorable conditions for obs. Misty with boat jumping like a flea." Normally, in taking a sight, the perimeter of the sun is brought down to the horizon with the sextant. Now the best that Worsley could do was to peer through the mists at the sun's blurred image and try to estimate its center. Again and again, he took sight on the theory that when he averaged them out, he might come up with a reasonably accurate fix. He finally put the position at 54 degrees 38 minutes south, 39 degrees 36 minutes west, 68 miles from the tip of South Georgia, but he warned Shackleton not to put much stock in it. The original plan had been to round the western tip of South Georgia, passing between Willis and Bird Islands, then swing east and run along the coast to the whaling station at Leith Harbor. But that had assumed reasonably decent navigating conditions and had not taken into account the shortage of water. Now it no longer mattered where they landed, just so long as they did land. So they altered course to the east, hoping to hit anywhere on the west coast of the island, and it was of very little consequence where. It turned out, too, that the water situation was considerably more serious than they had first imagined. Not only was the water brackish, but it was polluted with sediment and reindeer hairs which had somehow gotten into the cask. This noisome liquid, that had to be strained through gauze from the medicine chest, was drinkable, but just barely so, and it only aggravated their thirst. Furthermore, Shackleton had reduced each man's ration to about a half cup per day, and the serving of hot milk at the beginning of each watch during the night had been eliminated. That afternoon, Shackleton informed them that for the rest of the voyage, they could only afford to have hush twice a day. Throughout the afternoon, there had been a mounting air of expectancy that they would sight some indication that the land was close by, birds or kelp or something. But there was none, and with the approach of evening, the attitude of expectancy gave way to one of apprehension, of a strangely paradoxical sort. By Worsley's estimate, they should have been a little more than 50 miles off the coast, but Worsley's calculations were admittedly crude, and they could easily have been much closer. On the west coast of South Georgia, there was not the smallest settlement, much less a beacon light or even a buoy to guide them. In fact, even to this day, the west coast of South Georgia is only sketchily charted. Thus, it was entirely conceivable that they might come upon the coast in the dark, suddenly and disastrously. On the other hand, their fear of running onto the island was oddly counterbalanced by the dread awareness that they might just as easily miss it altogether, run by it in the night, and never know it was there. Indeed, they might already have done so. The darkness was now complete, and the Caird pounded forward on an east-northeast course, and the wind on her port beam. The men peered ahead into the night with salt-rimmed eyes for the shadowy image of a headland, and they strained their ears for any unusual noise, perhaps the sound of surf pounding on a reef. But visibility could hardly have been worse. An overcast blotted out the stars, and the foggy mist still swept across the surface of the water. The only sounds that could be heard were the moaning of the wind through the stays and the surge of the heavy, confused sea that was running. Thirst, of course, heightened their expectation and prolonged each anxious minute. But in spite of the discomfort and uncertainty, there was an undercurrent of suppressed excitement. Each of the watches made wild, speculative guesses about how soon they would reach the whaling station and what it would be like to bathe and have clean clothes and sleep in a real bed and actually eat food served on a table. Gradually, the hours crept by, though there was nothing to indicate that they were nearing the coast. At 4 a.m., when Worsley's watch came on, Shackleton remained with him at the helm to keep a lookout for the land. They were making about 3 knots, and by 6 o'clock they should have been less than 15 miles offshore, but there was not a sign of it, not the smallest bit of ice or shred of seaweed. 7 o'clock came, 12 miles from the island, and yet no trace. The air of anticipation was slowly being replaced by a feeling of increasing tension. Some of the peaks on South Georgia were nearly 10,000 feet high. Surely they would be visible by now. At 8 o'clock, Shackleton's watch was due to take over, but nobody thought about watches. Instead, all hands crowded into the cockpit, searching ahead and to each side in an atmosphere of competition, of hoping, of anxiety, all at once. But there was only the sea and sky, just the same as there had always been. Toward 9 o'clock, Shackleton sent Crean below to prepare some hush. When it was ready, they ate it hurriedly in order to return to their lookout posts. It was a strange time, a time of eagerness and expectation, underscored by grave, unspoken doubts. It was all so nearly over, an occasion for excitement, even jubilation, and yet in the back of their minds was a nagging voice which refused to be silent. They might very well be looking in vain. If the island was there, they should have sighted it hours before. Then, at just after 10:30, Vincent spotted a clump of seaweed, and a few minutes later, a cormorant was sighted overhead. Hope flared anew. Cormorants rarely ventured farther than 15 miles from land. Soon the foggy mists began to break up, though ever so slowly. Ragged clouds still scudded along close to the surface of the water, but visibility was better. At noon, the fog was almost gone, but the interminably heaving sea stretched in every direction. Land, it was McCarthy's voice. Strong and confident, he was pointing dead ahead. And there it was, a black, frowning cliff with patches of snow clinging to its sides. It was just visible between the clouds, possibly 10 miles away. A moment later, the clouds moved like a curtain across the water, shutting off the view. But no matter, it was there, and they had all seen it.